The last person who was able to impose an authoritarian regime on Afghanistan was Genghis Khan. And what he did is the first time in central Bamiyan that the people rebelled against him. He just killed everybody and brought in Mongolians to repopulate the place. Ever since then, everybody who tries to impose an authoritarian regime fails. And that's because it's a very consensual kind of political setup where the whole idea is that you mobilize factions around the consensus on who's going to govern it. I think that's built into the settlement pattern, right? That you have pretty sophisticated urban centers that are involved in very long distance trade, but ungoverned spaces in between them, right? And if you look at the history of Afghanistan, you'll see that every single province, even though there's not very many people in these areas, has always been the center of a world empire. And the way they did it was always a puzzle for me. I went out to the World Heritage Monument, the minaret at Minaret of Jam, right? And there can't possibly have been more than 15,000 people in this empire that extended from Pakistan to Iran and across India. So how is that even possible, right? And this is the reason, is that they would mobilize very large numbers through alliances of different kinds that existed for the function of attacking everybody else, bringing back some loot, and they would eventually fall apart again. And we still see this model at play in Afghanistan, that when a foreign invader comes in, actually everybody can unite against that one, right? And as soon as that threat goes away, then the internal factional fighting starts all over again. What's made it more complicated in the 20th and 21st centuries has been the role of neighbors. So for a long time, Afghanistan was pretty isolated and able to attack other people. But starting in 1979, and actually, beginning with the British, like everywhere else in the world, that's screwed up today. But after that, right, starting in 1979 with the Soviet invasion, and it became part of the Cold War apparatus, that's still playing itself out. So if you look at where the factional divides are, right, you have the Taliban on one side, who were the Pashtun resistance against the Russians. Now you have the Tajiks, which is the northern alliance in the country, which is what the U.S. was supporting, the Mujahideen against the Russians. And that factional divide is still there, each with all their different alliances. So you will never understand Afghanistan if you don't look at the geopolitics of that region, right? Pakistan thinks that an unstable Afghanistan helps them in their ongoing struggles with India. Iran meddles less than it used to, but it used to see it as they're supporting Shia against a Sunni incursion from one side. And I gotta say, if you want a sort of amusing take on this, you remember who Steve Bannon was, the former guy's sort of policy advisor? Once said, he's actually smarter than he seems, even if he is a bit of a jerk. But one thing he said is, let's see what would happen if the U.S. just left, right? Would Iran want to see a radical Sunni state backed by Pakistan on its eastern border? He said, of course not, right? Would Russia ever plan to go back into Afghanistan, right? That will never happen again. They learned their lesson on that one. Would China like to see unstable Islamic radicalism coming up through the Wakhan corridor straight into where the Uyghurs are? So they're going to stop doing this. They said and his version is, the only thing holding all these countries together is that the United States is there. So if we were to just leave, the regional powers would work out a solution for this. I'm not sure he's right on that last one. They could still use Afghanistan like a stomping ground, but he does highlight the point that the geopolitics of Afghanistan are fundamental for understanding what's actually going on there today. Right. Now, within that, what you have is, and I wrote an article on this fairly recently, right? The extent to which Afghanistan is a relatively poor country, and when it's not attacking other people, it doesn't have that many resources. The resource that it has ever since the United States went in is an unbelievably wild amount of money coming in the form of foreign aid. So politics in Afghanistan are not about who gets to control industrial policy, or should we be pushing an export-led agricultural livestock program, or doing like they do in Ethiopia, where they just do a green revolution. It's all about who has access to the aid flows, right? And so if you don't understand that, you can't understand the sources of instability or corruption, or where the directions might be able to go. And that's why what the U.S. is doing now is actually fairly dangerous, right? That what the U.S. wants to do is get out, which is entirely understandable, but they want to get out in a way like we sort of got bored with this country, so it's time to go somewhere else. So let's just put in an alternative government and watch, let them have an Afghan-owned solution to this, even though we sort of set the stage, provided the director, paid for all the costumes, wrote the script, and now we can say the play is your problem. So I don't see this as a particularly sustainable kind of solution. Now, Ghani, who, for a long time, he was a close friend of mine, and that's where I worked, the president, is also an extremely bad manager. He took all his skills from working in the World Bank and brought them to the Afghan government. So everybody is polarized, right? Nobody gets along. He wants to be in charge of everything, micromanages these things. So rather than build an inclusive coalition that would have involved buying off some of the factions, he now has them all sort of united against him. And the U.S. comes in, and they all say, if you just get rid of him, we'll play along with you. Right? And that's what the next week conference in Istanbul is all about, is how to set up an interim government. I was just commenting to someone on how ironic it is that we finally get rid of Trump, right? And a human rights, ethically based foreign policy, the first thing it's going to do is cut a deal between religious fundamentalists and opium smuggling warlords to replace an elected government and put that in place. So just to answer your question on that, I just think the short version of this is it's complicated. But the longer version of it is that you can't understand it without looking at the geopolitics and the politics of foreign aid as being accelerants on what was going on inside Afghanistan. And we're now in year 50 of that dynamic.